All right, let's get started. So, this week is the last week of new content. As I warned, the semester would go by quickly. So next Thursday is the final exam, and next Wednesday is exam review day, so there shouldn't be any new content there unless for some reason there's a little bit left over. I would recommend that you get started on preparing for the in-class essay if you have not done so already. So a big chunk of today's class will be about Dennett, who is about half of the essay, and we'll be spending a good amount of time on Friday talking about David Chalmers, who is, roughly speaking, the other half. As I've pointed out, there are optional readings from those two gentlemen on E-class. Here's what I'll say. If you're only going to read one thing, I would recommend reading or having a look at the first Chalmers reading. And there are two reasons for that. One, the textbook has less on him. There's a whole chapter on Dennett, but only chunks of the consciousness chapter are on Chalmers. Additionally, I am, as will become evident, on Dennett's side of these debates. I used to be on Chalmers' side, so I'll still be able to mark a Chalmers answer fairly. But I will be spending somewhat more time on Dennett. So if you want a fuller answer, I would recommend looking at the Chalmers reading, but as I say, it's not required to get full marks. So before starting on the functionalist chapter, I want to revisit the issue of conceptual confusion in psychology, this idea from Wittgenstein. And I want to do this because I listened to the lecture and I thought it may have been unclear which thoughts were Wittgenstein's thoughts and which thoughts were mine, or which thoughts were potential problems with it. And I want to make sure it's crystal clear what he thought and what Wittgensteinians tend to argue on the basis of his views. So the way, and I know this because I had a Wittgensteinian professor in undergrad, and he was very picky. Wittgensteinians are very picky. And so I want to be as clear as I can be. So the way that they standardly put the issue is this. They draw a sharp distinction between an ordinary language concept, like say intelligence. So that's an ordinary language concept. And a technical concept or a technical term that scientists make up. So say, IQ score. So that's a technical term. So the top kind, or the ordinary language term, is going to have a set of different uses that are related in a subtle and complex way. It's not going to be possible in most cases to reduce it to a single sentence definition. And that's what psychologists start out being interested in, is the ordinary language concept. Then they put forward a technical term that's more measurable and tractable. And they discover various things about that technical notion. So we know lots of empirical facts about IQ. We know things that it's correlated with, brain structures that it's correlated with. We know about the degree of heritability, where heritability is defined as, depends how you want to put it, but we tap into heritability with things like twin studies, as I'm sure you all know. So we discover all these various empirical things about the technical term. The conceptual confusion bit is thinking that you've discovered something about intelligence. So in the discussion section of the paper, you say, we've discovered that intelligence is such and such percentage heritable, or whatever. But in fact, all you've discovered is something about IQ. I mentioned last class that there is a kind of family resemblance relationship between Wittgenstein's philosophy and positivism or operationism, because it emphasizes observable behavior, or both views emphasize observable behavior. And my Wittgensteinian prof said that when we're defining this term, we should do so in an operationist way. We should give operational definitions. meaning we define it in terms of how it's measured. And my professor would say very emphatically, we are not free to define this term. Intelligence is already defined in ordinary language. So that's roughly the Wittgensteinian picture. It's a very compelling picture, and you should be familiar with it for the test. In my lecture last class, I gestured at two possible criticisms of this, but this is separate from what you should know about Wittgenstein's perspective. One way in which I would depart from this is in the history of the physical sciences, people often take an ordinary language term and give it a new definition, but they'll still use the same word. So the example I gave was temperature, right? Temperature started out as an ordinary language term, and it has various uses. But physicists define temperature in terms of a theory. They give a new definition of it. And that's the second, so the first point of departure is in the physical sciences, people often use the ordinary language term when making a new technical term. But the second point of departure is it's possible to define that new term in relation to a theory, not strictly in terms of observation or measurement. So in the case of temperature, temperature is defined not as the readout on a thermometer, but as molecular motion, as the mean kinetic energy of the molecules, basically how fast are the molecules moving. Whereas my prof tended to say, no, when you're making a technical term, it should be defined operationally, not in terms of a theory. So those are 2 points of departure, but make sure you have distinct in your head what was Wittgenstein and what was my commentary. Relatedly, there was a key term that I forgot to mention, which directly relates to this. I believe it comes from one of the positivists. I think it's Carnap. Don't quote me on that. But the term is conceptual engineering. Now, this means modifying or engineering, if you like, a term or a concept so that it is more useful for the purpose of theorizing. So for example, psychologists have made various attempts to define intelligence in relation to things like cognitive ability. That those definitions are not as precise or as well agreed upon as the definitions in physics, but the goal is to engineer or modify the concept so that it's more useful. And I think it's perfectly permissible to do this as long as you keep clear in your head that there's a difference between this new definition that you've given and the ordinary language one. I don't think it matters if you use the same word like intelligence, as long as you keep clear in your head that you are engaged in conceptual engineering. Any questions about this? Okay. The other thing I wanted to quickly say, because someone asked me about it after class, they asked about the phenomenological fallacy, so I'll quickly repeat that in case it was a little bit unclear. So, in ordinary speech, when we speak of properties like redness or greenness or whatever, we ascribe those properties to things in the world. We say the apple is green, the sky is blue, etc. But within a certain philosophical tradition in philosophy of mind, it's very tempting to, and very commonly, this commonly is done, to ascribe those properties to mental states. To say things like, I'm having a greenish experience or a reddish inner experience. It's a very tempting way of thinking, and if you think that's right, that there are such things as greenish experiences, that poses a serious problem for the mind-brain identity theory, because there's nothing green in the brain. So it seems like it's very easy to infer from that mental states cannot be brain states. But the mind-brain identity theorists have responded by saying that form of reasoning rests on a fallacy or a mistake. And the mistake is attributing properties that are actually properties of things in the world to mental states. So mental states aren't green, apples are green, or grass is green, etc. And to say my mental state is green is a kind of mistake. Now, it's controversial whether that is in fact a fallacy. Sometimes I think when people hear the term fallacy, they think, oh, like this was handed down by God and this is just the way it is. In philosophy, they distinguish between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. The informal ones are more loose, and some of them are controversial. So Chalmers, for example, would contest that it's fallacious to speak that way. So, but whether or not it's right to call it a fallacy, that's what it means. Any questions on that? Okay, one more thing from last class that we just didn't have time to get to is embodied cognition. So I'll briefly talk about that, and then we'll move on to functionalism, which is the topic for today. So embodied cognition is a new, you could call it a paradigm or a research program that is emerging in psychology and cognitive science. I think it's fair to say it's still a minority position, but it has influence, it's growing, and it's relevant to the chapter on the mind-brain identity theory. Don't go crazy with this. If it's on the test at all, it definitely won't be a short answer question. I just want you all to be aware of it, because who knows, maybe in 20 years it'll be the dominant paradigm. The Embodied Cognition Research Program emphasizes the relevance of parts of the body other than the brain to thinking. So standardly in psychology and cognitive science, we think that the real work is done by the brain, and that we can kind of ignore what the rest of the body is doing. But the embodied cognition paradigm emphasizes the ways in which other parts of the body are relevant. And we have to talk about other sensitivities or reactions that the body can engage in. And you can see this as continuous with different things. So one thing that, one way in which you can see this as continuous with Wittgenstein is Wittgenstein says, and Wittgensteinians tend to say, that mental states are not states of the brain, but states of the whole organism, states of the whole person. And you can also think of specific theories in psychology, some of which came before the Embodied Cognition Research Program, but things like the James Lange theory of emotion. How many of you remember the James Lange theory from Intro Psych? You all really repress intro Psych material, but fair enough. So the James Lange theory is that bodily reactions come before the experience of emotion. So the idea is that, the naive view, or I shouldn't say naive, but the common sense view is first you feel sad, and as a result of that, you tear up and your heart rate changes and various other things happen. But the James Lange theory says, no, the bodily reactions come first, and then your emotion is just you becoming aware of those bodily reactions. So the fast heart rate comes first, and then the feeling of fear. So those are some examples that may help you see where the Embodied Cognition Research Program is coming from. And I'll actually show a quick video of someone explaining it, just so you can hear it from someone who subscribes to it. So he then goes on to talk about specific examples of embodied cognition perspectives, but we're not going to go into that level of detail. Now, clearly when you hear embodied cognition people speak, it sort of seems obvious that, yeah, there's got to be something to that. But at the same time, there's also clearly something special about the brain. And it's difficult to make precise exactly what is special about the brain in relation to thought. It's tempting to say experiences, mental states are in the brain, but people like Wittgenstein would object to that. One thing I tried to say last class is, one thing that's true of the brain that is not true of any other part of the body is the brain alone could be the subject of experience. It's certainly a reasonable inference based on everything we know that you could remove a brain from the body, and as long as it had the relevant nutrients and the relevant simulated inputs, it could still have experiences. And when I say have experiences, you could even cash that out behavioristically, where if you were to put the brain back into the body, the person would say, oh yes, I was having this very vivid sensation of seeing red. It seemed like I was having it, even though I was just in a vat with nutrients and signals being sent to it. Okay, let's get started on the chapter on functionalism. So, functionalism is probably today the most popular view in philosophy of mind. And I'm not just guessing, they actually have done polls. If you're curious what philosophers think about various controversial issues, they've done a couple of surveys, and they ask philosophers lots of controversial questions, and ask which view do you lean towards or accept. And in the case of consciousness, they broke it down like this. So the middle three, eliminativism, functionalism, and identity theory, those are all materialist views. Eliminativism is the view that consciousness doesn't exist. Some have accused Dennett of falling in that bucket. He would probably contest that. And then identity theory we've already talked about. So dualism at 20%, I'm actually kind of surprised it's that high. But functionalism has the plurality. So it's not a majority, but it's the most popular view. And certainly among materialist views, it's by far the biggest chunk. Now, of course, we don't settle issues by majority vote, but this is certainly an important perspective to be aware of. If you had to define functionalism in one sentence, it would be that mental states are defined by what they do. That's the one sentence definition. They are defined by what they do. Or, of course, you could say their function or their functional role. This means that they are not defined in terms of their material composition. Having said that, functionalists are still, as I just said, materialists. They don't believe in souls or mystical aspects of the mind. They think that mental states are, in the case of humans, brain states, but they have, and this is an important term to know, mental states are or have multiple realizability. Which means there are multiple different ways that the same mental state could be realized. So let's take pain as an example. We will see various attempts to make this more precise, but to a first approximation, to be in the state of pain is defined as a state which has various effects, including causing you to withdraw from the stimulus that caused the state, causing you to believe that you have been damaged, causing you to desire that the state stop, right? So that's what pain is. It's defined in terms of those effects. Now, within humans, the exact neurological state which accomplishes that may be slightly different. It need not be that there's one exact pattern of activation that instantiates pain. And more radically, it need not in principle be a brain state at all. It could be some kind of mechanical state. You could imagine a machine which, if it had the right kinds of functional sensitivities to the environment and the right sorts of causal reactions, a machine could also have a state which we would call pain. As long as it had the same effects, a functionalist is going to say it's the same state. So there are multiple ways the same state could be realized or instantiated. The way that we define pain in this way, or the way that we get at this definition, is through something called abstraction. And abstraction, it's a word we use a lot, but what it really means is subtraction. You subtract away various features. So, as an example, suppose I draw various shapes. So I draw like a red square, just pretend these are drawn well, a red circle, a red triangle, and I could draw a blue square, a blue circle, and a blue triangle. Now, if I engage in abstraction, what I could do, for example, is speak of the squares on the board. And what I'm doing then is I'm subtracting away the details of what color they are and other features, and just speaking of them as squares. So just talking about all the squares. Or I could speak of all the red things, and then I'd be subtracting or ignoring their shapes and just talking about their color. And the same is true with functionalism. What you do is you ignore the irrelevant physiological details and focus on functional role or the effects of the state. Even though in every specific case, a mental state will always be a physical state. It's never going to be a magical woo-woo state. It's always going to be a physical state, but it's not defined in terms of its physical characteristics. One example that my professor in philosophy of mind gave was the Unabomber. Do any of you know who the Unabomber was? So, kind of a famous, let's just say not the greatest person. So he would let me start over. When we first came up with the name Unabomber, we knew there were various bombs being sent to different locations that fit a certain pattern, and so we inferred they were coming from a single source. So at the time, what Unabomber meant was whatever or whoever is sending these bombs. Probably it's a person, but in theory it could have been like an AI from the future coming back and doing it. What Unabomber means is whatever or whoever is sending these bombs all over the place. So you could say it's defined in terms of its effects. Now it turns out it's a guy named Ted Kaczynski, but the word Unabomber doesn't mean Ted Kaczynski. When it was put forward, it just meant whoever is sending these bombs. In cognitive psychology, one related idea is the software-hardware distinction. This is an idea that's very similar to the points that functionalists put forward. So, what the cognitive psychologists argued in the cognitive revolution was you could know about mental states without knowing too much of the details of how the brain actually works. What you're interested in is what the mental states do and what their relation is to other mental states. But you don't actually need to know the details. Just like in computers, and this is only an analogy, it's not like the brain literally has software, but you can know a lot about the software of a computer program without knowing how the transistors work. So you could know how Microsoft Word works, for example, like which things to press, etc., even though you have no idea how the transistors are actually accomplishing those computational tasks. That's not because there's like a dualism or something between software and hardware, where the software is this invisible thing. It's just you're describing it at different levels of analysis. And to make this point in more detail, I have a video from Hilary Putnam talking about how the rise of computers helped us to see the inside of this way of looking at them. Okay, so hopefully that reinforces that point. This is one point of contrast between the functionalists and the behaviorists, because the functionalists are interested in looking at what the nature of the mental states are, whereas the behaviorists thought whatever goes on in the mind or the brain or whatever is a kind of black box. And here I'm referring to the psychological behaviorists. They thought that you can look at the input-output relationships, so what the stimulus is and what the resultant behavior is, but you can't look at what's in the black box, whereas the functionalists thought you could theorize about what the structure of the black box, of what's inside the mind is. We'll see some examples of that later. Now, on the notion of, or related to the notion of multiple realizability, you'll see that there are some key terms that relate to the sense of identity, because there is a sense in which the functionalists are still identity theorists, but we have to distinguish between type identity and token identity. Now, you might think, oh, annoying philosophers making up distinctions, but this is an important distinction. Cough, cough might be on the test. So let's first distinguish between types and tokens. So a type here just means like a category. So you can think of the category cats. Right, so it's a category, is a whole set of individuals underneath that category. An example of a token would be like Luca, my cat, back in BC. So type is a category, a token is an individual. So in the case of the mind or the brain, we have different, what we might call neural or brain types. So for example, different types of brain activity. So low serotonin could be a kind of or brains in the state of low serotonin, or brains in the particular state of C fiber activation. And that would be an umbrella. You're referring to lots of different brain states with a term like that. And then we have various mental types. So categories of mental states. So being in pain, being happy, being jealous, whatever. So type identity theory, which a lot of the early mind-brain identity theories seemed to be, what that implies is you can identify mental types as neural or physical types. So the mental type being depressed, that's a category of mental states, can be identified with being in a state of low serotonin. Those two categories just are the same thing. The functionalists reject that. They say type identity is false. You cannot identify mental types with neural or physical types. By contrast, token identity, to say you're a token identity theorist, means any particular example of a mental state will be identical with a particular brain state. So Bob is depressed at this time. His state of being depressed will be identical with some pattern of brain activity. Probably it'll be a very complicated one, but it's not going to be identical with some non-physical soul thing. It's going to be identical with a particular brain state. So, whatever the complicated pattern is. As I say, this is connected with multiple realizability. Because if type identity was true, this would be false, multiple realizability. If mental states as categories, pain, happiness, whatever, were identical with particular neural or types of neural patterns, then that's the only thing that can instantiate those mental states. They couldn't be on a computer, or they can't be different between people. But given that type identity is not false, type identity is not true, according to the functionalists, mental states can be instantiated in different ways, as long as they accomplish the same functional role. Even though, in every particular case of a mental state, it will be identical with a particular pattern of physical activity. So this is a subtle distinction, but it's important to understand. I see some slight looks of puzzlement. Any questions about this distinction?
Can you explain the type identity once more?
Yes, so it means that a particular category or type of mental states will be identical with a particular type of brain state. So for example, one mental type is being depressed. That's not one example, that's like a whole category. It refers to a whole bunch of different states that people have. And then we have the neural type being low serotonin. That's a type of mental state. Now, it's a little bit unfair to make that example because we know it's false, but just to help you see what it would mean, if you're a type identity theorist, you would say something like the mental type being depressed is identical with the neural type being low serotonin. So the functionalists say, no, that's not right. Being depressed is defined in terms of its functional role, in terms of what it does. But in any particular case, like Bob, when Bob's depressed, yes, his being depressed is going to be something in his head that's doing that functional role. So that's the token identity part. Mental states are always identical with physical states, but only at the token level, at the individual level. Yeah.
Do functionalists accept the idea of token then?
Yes.
Okay.
So functionalists accept this,
Okay.
but don't accept this. Yes, exactly. Any other questions about this? Okay, another annoying philosophy term that you have to know is supervenience. So as I just finished saying, the functionalists accept the idea of token identity. One thing that this implies, or at least the functionalist perspective implies, is the idea of supervenience. So what supervenience means in the case of mental states. So the way that functionalists will speak is mental states supervene on physical states. What that means is there cannot be a change in the mental state without a change in the physical state. So let's say Bob goes from being sad to being happy. And someone says, wow, it's amazing. He went from being sad to being happy, but absolutely nothing in his brain changed. A functionalist is going to say that's not possible. You cannot move from one mental state to another without a corresponding change in the brain or the computer or whatever the physical instantiation is. Another way of saying it, you can't have, well, I'll stick with that, but note, this only goes one way for the functionalists. You could have two different physical states that instantiate the same mental state. That's possible. But the reverse is not true. You can't move from one mental state to another with no change in the physical state. That's what supervenience means. Another kind of analogy that the book talks about is thinking of a functional role as a kind of job description. So you could think of, the definition of the term vice president. It's defined in terms of your kind of position in a network, the kinds of orders you can give, etc. It's not defined as in terms of material properties, even though all the vice presidents I've seen have been physical beings. It's not defined in terms of its physical properties. And then again, final analogy or something that might help is, the definition of various types of organs. So something like an eye. I don't know how many of you have seen the eye of an insect up close, but it's quite a different sort of physical thing than a human eye, or you can think of a robot eye. Eyes are defined in terms of what they do, right? They provide visual information to the organs. So, as I said, there are different attempts to kind of visually represent this or make it more precise. I've been speaking about pain as an example. So, pain is going to be defined in terms of its position in a causal dispositional network. So, part of the definition of pain is that it is characteristically caused by bodily damage. At least that's part of how we pick out which states are pain. Maybe in some cases, a similar state can be caused by a really weird kind of hallucination, but at least the way we pick out which states are pain is they are the kinds of states that are normally caused by bodily damage. You can think of other cases, right? Like part of the definition of jealousy is that it's characteristically caused by the perceived possibility of infidelity or something like that. So bodily damage causes a particular state called pain. And then another part of the definition is what this state does. So it will cause the belief that your body has been damaged. It will cause the desire that the state that's been caused stop. And then you can think of these together producing various types of avoidance behavior, right? Pulling away from the thing, not going towards that thing in the future, like if it's a hot stove or something. So there has to be some kind of connection, direct or indirect, with behavior. And to spell this idea out more, I have a video on Dennett, from Dennett. This isn't the chapter on him, but he gives quite a good functionalist account, both of pain and of visual perception, of, in his case, seeing the blue sky. So, watch that. Okay, so that was very well said. So he spoke there both about pain and visual perception. And I think what he said is very insightful, particularly about pain. How, in part, what pain is it's an attention grabber. Normally you have the capacity to focus on things, but part of what pain does is it takes away your capacity to pay attention to other things. And as I've said here, just kind of simplistically, It affects your beliefs. You believe that you've been damaged, and your desires. And both of those will, as you can see, also be defined in terms of their effects, including their effects on behavior. So this is just an oversimplified kind of schema of a functionalist picture. Dan added some other things that you could have in mind with a term like pain. There's another Dennett video I was going to show here, but we'll be seeing more of him later today, so I think I'll just hold that, maybe show it later. I do sometimes decide to not show videos, but in the links, in the description of the YouTube video, there will always be that Google Doc link if you want to rewatch or watch any of the videos, but I think I'll skip that for now. All I'll say is, if you look at a picture like this, it's very tempting to think that something is left out. But yeah, sure, like you're explaining something about consciousness, but what you've missed, say in the case of pain, is what the pain feels like. It seems like there's something left out. That intuition, of course, will be hammered on very, or will be defended very firmly by someone like Chalmers. So I just flagged that because that's going to come up next class. Dennett's claim, of course, is that our sense that there's something left out by this picture is a kind of illusion. That really is the core of the debate between Chalmers and Dennett. Okay, the next chapter, chapter 7, this is kind of like chapter 3, where chapter 3 I kind of went through some of the key ideas but skipped certain parts. Chapter 7 is like that, so as always, if it's not in the key terms, don't worry about it. But there's a few ideas in this chapter that are worth talking about, including possibly the most famous thought experiment in all of philosophy of mind. So I thought it was worth including at least bits of this chapter. So the representational theory of mind is a type of functionalist account that is even more deliberately built on the analogy with computers. And the key word, of course, is represent, right? So representational. So the idea here is that there are brain states, or it could be computational states, that are representations of the world. A representation you can think of as a kind of internal model, a kind of model of the world. And there are, so I put up here a standard functionalist way of describing mental states, but one way of doing so that's simpler is to say all mental states fall in one of two categories, two different types of representational states. So representational states represent the world. They are models of the world. And there are two types: beliefs and desires. So this is a simpler way of talking about mental states. A belief is any state that represents the way the world is. So belief here is a bit more elastic than the ordinary language sense of the term. So perceptual states would count as a kind of belief. You know, I see the donut on the table, that's a kind of belief that there's a donut on the table. Even though ordinarily we would call that a perception, this is a way of kind of putting everything into two buckets. So a belief is something that represents the way the world is. And crucially, it can do so incorrectly, right? You can have a false belief. So if suppose I come down with a bad case of schizophrenia, and I think there's a pink rabbit walking into the room, and I even have a perceptual experience, yeah, I'm representing there's a pink rabbit, even though, of course, there isn't one. And then a desire is any state that represents the way you want the world to be. So it's a kind of goal state. You think the world is like this right now, that's a belief, but you would like the world to be like this. So, really simple example that the book gives, let's say it gets too hot in here. I don't think you can open these windows, but let's say it could be opened. My belief is the window is closed. So I'm representing the world to be such that the window is closed. My desire would be I'm representing the state I want the world to be in, which is the window is open. And the idea here is you can predict people's behavior just using these two things, right? You can talk about how they think the world is, how they think the world should be, and then on that basis you can predict what they do. In this case, you'd predict I would open the window. Dennett will say something similar. Now, one person who took this idea to a kind of an extreme, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about him. He's another kind of enemy of Dennett, if you like, is someone named Jerry Fodor. So Fodor thinks that these kinds of states are literally states that you could identify in the brain, and that they are sort of written in what he called the language of thought. So there's a kind of neural code for thoughts that if you want to know whether or not someone believes something, you look in their brain to find the beliefs. Like, yes, there is activation state X, and that is their belief. And we can see that in the neural language of thought, they are thinking X, Y, Z. Like I say, I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that's Fodor's main idea. Now, how does this help us with understanding how computers could do things? Well, one thing the chapter talks about is how to program these kinds of competences into computers. And understanding how this works requires a distinction between syntax and semantics. I won't ask if you remember this from intro. I will just assume that you have all repressed everything. Both of these relate to language. So the syntax or syntactical rules in a language have to do with the structural features of a language, like the shapes of the letters, the order in which the letters are supposed to appear, things like that. So suppose I want to communicate the idea that the cat is on the mat. The semantics has to do with the shapes of these letters and the order in which they appear. The semantics of a sentence is the meaning. So, I'm very bad at drawing, but you get the idea. That's supposed to be a mat, I guess. So that would be the semantics of the sentence, the cat is on the mat, right? What the sentence means. Now here's a kind of bold idea that really all of our lives with computers is based on. You can set up a system where you only program in certain syntactical rules, but you can nonetheless get it to behave as if it understands semantics. So one example the book gives is you could program in an understanding of certain logical rules. So this is somewhat harkening back to the pauper section. So here's an example of a grammatical rule. H implies O. Not actually. So in the pauper section we talked about modus tollens. I'll use modus ponens since that's what the book says. So modus ponens would be this. So, and it doesn't have to be H or O. It could be A, B, anything. But this implies this, that, therefore O. So you could program into a computer to obey this principle of modus ponens. And crucially, you can then put anything in H and O. You could also tell it, if you see if da-da-da-da, then da-da-da-da, and the first part, then the second part follows. And then any set of letters you put in here and there, it will correctly infer the second part. And you can program in this kind of logical competence without the computer knowing anything about what these things mean. So that's the idea of what the book calls a syntactical machine. It's something that you don't program in any semantic understanding. You just program in that it obeys certain syntactical rules, but you can get competence that mimics semantic understanding. Any questions about that idea? Yes?
Could you explain more about the semantic engine?
Yeah, sorry, the term the book used, that's right, it's semantic engine. I think I said it my way because it's a little bit misleading for it to put it that way. But yeah, a semantic engine really should have been called a syntactical engine, but it's something that only has syntactical rules programmed in, but it behaves as if it understands the semantic principle. So the computer doesn't need to know what these things mean, but it still makes a correct logical inference, purely on the basis of syntactical rules. Okay, next, we'll talk about the Turing test. So how many of you have heard of Alan Turing? How many of you have seen the movie The Imitation Game? It's an excellent movie. So that's a movie about his life. So Alan Turing, one of the most important people who's ever lived. If you had to give one person credit for inventing computers, it would be him. It's always hard to know exactly who to give the credit, but if you had to give it to one person, it'd be him. He, of course, invented them to crack the Enigma code during World War II that the Germans were using. Various estimates as to how many years that shortened the war, but it had a very profound effect on the Allies' chances of winning, which of course in the end they did win. Turing wrote a very important paper in which he asked the question, can machines think? Can machines be intelligent? And so he proposed this test that I'm sure, most of you raised your hand, so most of you have heard of this. And the test is meant to be a kind of operational definition of intelligence. So he starts out by saying, what is intelligence? And he considers various theories and says, it's kind of hard to define in theoretical terms. We'll just give this operational definition. And the basics of the test, if we were to translate it into modern terms, is if there's, two rooms, one with a conscious person and one with an AI of some kind, and both are having a kind of text conversation with a real human, if a human can't tell which one's the AI and which one's the real person, for all practical purposes, that AI is intelligent. If there's no difference in the linguistic responses that it gives, no detectable difference in terms of how competent the system is with language, then again, for all practical purposes, that system is intelligent. Okay, so we'll have a little bit of fun. I'll show a clip from a movie, Ex Machina, showing an example of a Turing test in action. So we'll have a look at that, and then I'll say a couple quick things, and then we'll take a break. Okay, so great movie. There's a nice twist at the end, but that should give you a sense of what's meant by the Turing test if you didn't already know. And actually, I think that's all I have to say before the break. So after the break, we'll see the Chinese room thought experiment, which is probably the most famous thought experiment in philosophy of mind. But any questions before the break? Okay, come back at 1:05. Okay, let's get started. So as I say, we'll now get started on talking about the single most possibly famous thought experiment in philosophy of mind, which is the Chinese room. This was put forward by John Searle, who, by the way, it turns out, not the most ethical person. Multiple accusations of sexual harassment and assault. I don't know why, but it seems to be particularly a problem in philosophy of mind. A lot of really famous philosophers of mind, I don't know why, as opposed to other areas of philosophy. Another big name, one of the most cited philosophers of mind, Colin McGinn, similar accusations. Of course, it's not relevant to whether their ideas are right, but unfortunately it turns out John Searle, not the best person, possibly. But maybe I shouldn't have started with that. Okay, remember that later. But so John Searle's idea, the Chinese room, is this thought experiment. So here's what you're supposed to imagine. Actually, before that, I want to make a distinction that he makes between two types of AI, weak AI and strong AI. The video I'll show will make the same distinction. Weak AI is any computational system that accomplishes a task that a human normally would. You're not making any claim about whether it's intelligent or let alone conscious, just it's able to do certain tasks. So the vast majority of AI, certainly before the last few years, would definitely be weak AI. A strong AI is something that is intelligent like a human is. So you could debate some recent versions. Probably no AI is this right now, but some you could maybe debate. But strong AI means no, it actually does think or actually is intelligent. And Searle's argument is against the possibility of the latter. He thinks that a system that merely manipulates symbols or ones and zeros or whatever can't be intelligent in the sense that humans are. And so he puts forward this idea of the Chinese room. So here's what you're supposed to imagine. John, the person, is in a room filled with books that tell you what symbols of Chinese to produce, or Mandarin, if you see another set of symbols. And outside is an actual Chinese speaker doing a Turing test for Chinese competence. So does the person in the room actually understand Chinese? That's what this person is supposed to figure out. And they pass notes under the door, and then papers come back with Chinese written on it. And Searle, who doesn't speak a word of Chinese or know a word of Chinese, just follows the instructions on these books. So he sees a certain pattern of Chinese, flips through the books until he finds the right thing, and then writes out what it says to write, and then hands it back. So that's the situation. Now, as Dennett will say later, there are very serious problems with even conceiving of how this could happen, but leave that aside for now. The question is, does John understand Chinese? And the intuition that he wants you to have is obviously not, right? He doesn't know a word of Chinese, he's just manipulating symbols, which is all that computers are doing. They don't have any semantic understanding, they're just manipulating symbols, and therefore also don't have any actual understanding of what they're processing. So very compelling thought experiment. You first hear it, you're like, well, that sounds right. Yeah, there's no way, and there's no sense in which John understands Chinese. He's merely manipulating symbols. So very short and simple. Any questions on the intuition this is supposed to produce? Okay, so show a quick video kind of to help you visualize it, and then I'll talk a bit about Dennett's response. Actually, leave the lights off. I'll just go straight into the next video. So he mentions at the end what you should know in your key terms as the systems reply. That's a term actually that Searle invented, and one person who defends that reply is Dennett. So I have another video, unfortunately audio only, but this is Dennett responding to the Chinese room. Good, so we saw two things there. We saw a visualization of the Chinese room and then Dennett's response. So Dennett really says two things. The first thing he says is, and this is often a problem with thought experiments, in order to actually make it work, you would have to assume some pretty insane and literally impossible things, like the person in the room would have to be, moving faster than the speed of light in order to go through the billions and billions of lines of instruction. So already that's a pretty serious problem for taking it too seriously. And then he gives the example, just to give us a sense of how complicated they would have to be. There would have to be represented in the instructions something like imagination or visualization. So the example he gave was, and this would be for English, like the letter J and the letter D. But another example that he's given in his book that actually would be an example of Chinese is the following. I don't know if any of you speak Mandarin or can see what's going on here, but so this is strictly speaking gibberish in Mandarin, but someone was fired for writing this sentence. And if you look at it, what's going on, what's supposed to be, or what it represents, is a series of tanks, and I believe that a letter actually does mean person or something like that. And then it represents the tanks kind of moving over the person, and then it's just a mess. This, of course, conjures up the image of Tiananmen Square, and so thus the person was in a lot of trouble for writing this. Now, writing that out in Chinese, putting it under the door and saying, what does this make you think of, is a perfectly legitimate use of the Turing test, or a question in the Turing test. And somehow in these code books, that's going to have to be able to be represented. So it's quite a difficult to imagine situation. But what Dennett says is, if you could have someone in there moving faster than the speed of light and have visual imagery represented, the whole system would have intelligence. It would understand Chinese. As it says in the video, understanding in computers is not in the CPU, which is what does the processing, it's in the whole system. So that's what is meant by the systems reply. Understanding is not in one particular unit in the system, but in the whole system. Now note, one thing that's often missed in this context is this is not a test of consciousness per se, it's a test of understanding or intelligence. And I think that a functionalist can, or has the resources to distinguish those two things. Consciousness, on a functionalist view, involves far more effects and reactions than just language. Language is just one subset of the functional capacities that humans have. So I want to briefly say a little bit about whether AI could be conscious. This is, of course, a very pertinent debate nowadays. So I am, broadly speaking, committed to a functionalist picture of the mind. At the very least, I think it's a very fruitful way of looking at it. It seems like the best game in town. So on a functionalist view, could AI be conscious? Here's what I think a functionalist has to say. If a machine or an AI could mimic all of the behavioral reactions and sensitivities of a human, then it would be conscious. I think you have to say that. As long as the same functional roles are realized, there's nothing left to be different between a human and an AI. It's not as though there's something intrinsically magic about carbon or hydrogen that makes us conscious. It's a matter of the effects that the processing states have. However, one thing that is not often discussed is it could be the case, for boring chemical reasons, that there is something special about carbon-based things. So I think we would all accept that it is not possible to make a conscious system out of purely hydrogen. Is that because hydrogen doesn't have a little soul or something? No, because you couldn't build a system with the right kinds of reactions. It can't make enough, combinations or functional reaction. And there are other chemicals that you quite clearly could not make a reactive system out of. And as far as we know, there are far more chemical combinations you can make with carbon than you can make without carbon, right? Organic life has just way more compounds that you can make, as far as we know. Some people try to say maybe silicon comes close, maybe you could make something pretty complicated out of that. But it might turn out that in order to replicate all of the sensitivities, functions, and reactions that we do, you may actually need organic chemicals. But if that's true, it's just for boring chemical reasons. It's not because carbon has a soul or something, again, on a functionalist view. But again, if you could replicate all the functions, all the reactions, etc., with a machine, then I think you do have to say the machine would be conscious if you're a functionalist. Okay, any questions about those issues? Or any thoughts? You all are welcome to push back. Okay. So the rest of the representational chapter, don't worry about. Those are the only concepts that I think we need to consider. So we'll now move on to the chapter on Dennett. There's a chance we don't finish all of it, so we may have a little bit left over for Friday, but that should be okay because I've pre-recorded Friday's lecture and it was on the shorter side, so we have a little bit of room if we need to wrap up Dennett on Friday. But I'll see how far we get. So as I said previously, Dennett passed away recently. I have a little confession to make, I suppose. So I first heard of Dennett when I would watch, I don't know if any of you remember they're very popular in the mid-2000s, the Four Horsemen of Atheism, kind of a joke label they gave themselves. There were these public intellectuals, so including like Richard Dawkins and people like that, all being very critical of religion, and Dennett was one of the so-called Four Horsemen. And when I first watched that video, I fast-forwarded Dennett. I thought, boring old guy, not as funny or whatever. But as I have aged, I have found him to be extremely helpful. And I'll remind you at the beginning of the chapter what his kind of core idea is, at least as it pertains to consciousness. So, and I'm saying this in part to help you start to think about the in-class essay. So David Chalmers, who we'll see more of next class, distinguishes between the easy problems and the hard problem, where the easy problems have to do with function and behavior, explaining how the brain processes incoming signals and leads to various outputs. So the kinds of things we saw in the functionalist chapter, right? The various effects that these brain states have. Whereas the hard problem is, why is any of that processing and functioning, why does that instantiate consciousness? Why would any of that be associated with or be identical with the inner feeling of pain or the inner quale of seeing a blue sky or what have you? And one way of summarizing Dennett's position is there are only easy problems. And our sense that there's a hard problem is a kind of illusion. But before saying more about that, we have to do some background. We have to talk about some other things that Dennett thinks, many of which will help you understand his view on this. Some of them are sort of just aside, just other things that Dennett has argued for, and you can use any of them in your discussion. But I just say this to keep you aware of what the main distinction is between him and Dennett. But you're welcome to talk about other features of his thought in the class essay. The book has a brief discussion of Dennett's life. One thing that's good to know is he was supervised by Gilbert Ryle, who we saw in the behaviorist chapter, and there are some continuities there. Probably the most important discontinuity is that Dennett and his work is very continuous with psychology and neuroscience. Gilbert Ryle, and actually Wittgenstein too, thought you didn't need to know anything about the brain or experimental psychology to study the mind. You just look at how the terms are used in ordinary speech, and therefore avoid various types of confusion. Whereas Dennett says, no, it's very important to know empirical research. He has a story, I wasn't going to mention this, but it's a funny little story. So he came of age philosophically when people like Ryle and Wittgenstein were dominant, especially in the UK. And he was having a conversation with other graduate students, all of whom worshipped Wittgenstein and Ryle. And they were talking about what happens when your hand goes to sleep, right? So something's pressing on your arm and you have this sensation of your hand falling asleep, as we say. And they were all asking about how the terms were used, and Dennett said, first thing to do is get clear on what's going on in the nervous system. And they all looked at him like, what? Why would we care about that? So it was, at the time, a very radical view. Now, of course, it's the dominant view. So I'm going to go in a different order than the book does with regard to the three stances. So I think there was a question about this on the test. So Dennett thinks that there are three stances we can take when approaching an object. And stance is kind of a funny term for it, but it means a way of thinking about the object and a way of making predictions on the basis of what you think about the object. And those three are the physical stance, the design stance, and the intentional stance, which is, of course, the title of the chapter. So I'll start with the physical stance. When you adopt the physical stance, you treat an object as a physical thing governed by the laws of physics. And when you are trying to understand what that object is going to do next or how it works, those are the resources that you use, right? The laws of physics. So here, I'll use the physical stance right now. I view this marker as a physical object, and I therefore predict that if I drop it, if I release it without anything underneath it, it will fall. Okay, physical stance worked. Right? So I'm not attributing to the marker anything beyond its physical properties. With the design stance, when I use the design stance, I view an object as something designed for a particular purpose. So it's made to do something. So, when I look at the felt, I don't think about its purpose, or at least when I'm thinking about whether it will fall or not. I'm just thinking about its physical properties. I could do the same with the computer. If I took the physical stance with the computer, I could talk about how it falls, when I release it, etc. If I take the design stance, I assume that this computer has been made such that when I press the keys, those letters will appear on the screen. And so, that's the prediction I make, and sure enough, it comes true, because when I treat it that way, it enables me to predict what it will do. Now, the physical stance and the design stance are not mutually exclusive. So I could adopt a purely physical stance with regard to the computer. So instead of thinking about how the keys are designed to produce letters on the screen, I could predict that pushing the F key will make that shape appear on the screen by studying all the transistors in the computer and looking at how, when you push that, this happens, then this happens, and I would make the same prediction. But I would need way more information to make the same prediction using the physical stance. That's the key advantage. The advantage of moving up these levels is you gain efficiency in your ability to make predictions. You can make accurate predictions with much less information. And then the final move, which is most important for our purposes, is adopting the intentional stance. When I adopt the intentional stance, for a system, I treat it as something that has beliefs and desires, in the sense that we saw in the representational chapter, right? So a belief is just how the system represents the world to be, and a desire is a goal state, right? It represents how the system, quote, wants the world to be. And so it is quite obvious that it's useful to adopt that stance with humans, but Dennett thinks there are other systems that it's useful to adopt that stance. So one simple example that's used a lot in literature is a thermostat. You can adopt the intentional stance when looking at a thermostat, even though obviously it doesn't have beliefs and desires in the same sense we do. Thermostats have, in this sense, a single belief, and that belief is, what's the temperature in the room? It has, components that represent, in a purely functionalist sense, what the temperature in the room is. And it has a single desire, or a single goal state, namely to cause the room to be whatever temperature is programmed in, whatever you push. And if you adopt that stance with the thermostat, you will be able to predict what it does very successfully. Even though, again, you could just use the physical stance. You could look inside, look at all the wires, and predict what it will do, but it would be much harder than it would be if you adopt the intentional stance. With humans, it hardly needs explaining that it's much easier to predict what people will do if you adopt the intentional stance. Again, you could scan their brain and predict what they would do. If you had a perfect brain scanner, which we will never have, but in theory you could know where every quark is in their brain and predict what they will do, but that's too hard. Adopting the intentional stance is much more efficient. So I have a video that spells this out a little bit. It's another video of Dennett. One term you need to know just to know what he's talking about, he mentions Laplace's demon. Do any of you know this phrase, Laplace's demon? So this is a hypothetical idea. Laplace saw that it was a consequence of at least Newtonian physics, maybe not quantum physics, but it was a consequence of the physics of the day that if a hypothetical being knew the position and velocity of every atom, that being could predict what will happen next with 100% certainty. And to use Dennett's term, he could do so using just the physical stance. Now, quantum physics kind of throws a wrench into that because their physics is probabilistic, not deterministic, but that's what that term means. Dennett uses the term in the video, and its connection to these ideas is Laplace's demon only has access to the physical stance. So if we can get the lights, I'll show this Dennett video. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful. I want to discuss briefly a few consequences of this. So one way in which the intentional stance is relevant actually relates back to what we said about Dennett's disagreement with Hacker, that the Wittgenstein scholar we saw. Remember that Dennett thinks it's legitimate to ascribe an attenuated type of mental state to particular parts of the brain. So you can speak of the fusiform face area, detecting that something is a face, or representing that it's a face. And what you're doing there is kind of adopting the intentional stance towards parts of the brain, because it's useful for predicting what those brain systems will do. Additionally, this is a reason that Dennett is agnostic about the idea that Fodor put forward. Now, Fodor, don't worry about it. I forget if he's in the key terms, but don't worry too much about him anyways. He's the one who said that there are identifiable states of the brain that will be the belief states or the desire states. And Dennett thinks that it may turn out that way, but strictly speaking, when we attribute beliefs and desires to people, we're doing so because it's useful, because treating them as systems or agents with beliefs and desires enables us to predict what they do. Just exactly how it's instantiated in the brain, that's an empirical matter. It may not be that there's literally like a language of thought in the brain that we could decode. It may not turn out like that. Additionally, and this I definitely will not test you on, but it's sort of interesting, Dennett also is a philosopher who works a lot on evolutionary biology and what evolutionary biology means. And Dennett argues that it is perfectly appropriate to apply the design stance to biological systems. Now, Dennett is an atheist. He doesn't believe that God or any mystical force designed, literally, biological systems. But given that different biological systems are selected for because of what they do, so the heart is selected for because it pumps blood, which is a very, any organism that didn't do that, didn't get its genes passed on, it's perfectly appropriate to apply the design stance to the heart. It helps you understand and keep track of what the heart is doing and why. Now, some philosophers object and say, no, if it's not designed by an agent, it's not design. But what Dennett says is, it is designed as long as it's useful to apply the design stance. So I say that just as an aside. Now, I also have another aside, but this aside is testable. And that's to discuss free will. So free will doesn't come up in the Dennett chapter, but this is a philosophy of mind class, and free will was another one of his main areas. Although, any questions about the three stances before I move on to free will? Okay, so, and I'm partly doing this because the New York Times wrote a piece on Dennett after he passed away, and it butchered his view of free will. I was actually very angry, but I was a little cross, let's say. I actually emailed the New York Times telling them to correct it. I said, I'm teaching a class on Dennett, and you've completely missed. Basically what it said was, Dennett believed that free will doesn't exist or is a fantasy, which you can literally Google. It takes 5 minutes of Googling to know that's not what he thought. He would have been spinning in his grave if he saw that. So we'll talk a bit about Dennett's view of free will. I assume for some of you this will be kind of interesting. So this goes back to the issue of determinism, which we've talked about a few times. In philosophy, there are three important perspectives, and you can kind of map them like this. So for the top, we could do determinism is true. Yes or no. And then, do we have free will? Yes or no. So, if we think that determinism is true, so meaning all states or all events are determined by prior states, right? So Laplace's demon, if he knew where all the atoms were and what their velocity was at one moment, he could predict what will happen next with certainty. If you think that implies we don't have free will, so you think, yes, determinism is true, we don't have free will, this is sometimes called hard determinism. Right? Meaning, basically, you think determinism rules out free will. If you think we have free will, but determinism is false, so so dualists would be like this, at least of the Cartesian variety. So the soul is independent of the chain of physical causes, and it can introduce new effects that are not predetermined by prior states. That is called libertarian free will. And note, the term libertarian here has no connection to the political sense of the term. I mean, you could believe in both or only one. I did know a grad student who happened to be both a libertarian and believe in libertarian free will. We used to argue all the time. Actually, we still do. He's one of the few people I've kept in touch with. Just recently, I was like, you've got to give this up. I was not successful, but oh well. But Dennett's position, which is actually the majority view now, is compatibilism. I'm gonna run out of the room, whatever. which is that determinism is true, or at least it could be true, and it would in no way rule out free will. So, maybe there's some quantum randomness, but either way, whatever the physics says, the fact that events are determined by prior states does not rule out free will. And the reason that Dennett and other philosophers think this is that the way they define free will is just the ability to do what you want. Right? So you have the ability as a system with nice complicated frontal lobes to think about your decisions, to weigh different potential consequences, and think about what you want, and then decide to do a particular thing. The fact that the outcome of that thinking is predetermined, according to compatibilists, doesn't matter. As long as you are free to do what you want, that's all the free will that's worth wanting, as Dennett says. Now, does that make sense? So I'm going to say a bit more about this, but as a concept, does compatibilism make sense? It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, of course. Although you should, because it's right. So one little bit of name dropping I'll do, and I'll show another video. So my supervisor at Georgia State University, so I forget if I mentioned this, but I did my master's in philosophy before switching back to psychology. And my supervisor worked mainly on this. This was his main area. And so I'll show a video of him defending compatibilism, and I'll add a little bit more to that, and then we'll continue through the Dennett chapter. So I forgot to mention this, but what he's referring to there is experiments we've already talked about, which is the experiments done by Benjamin Libet, those experiments where you can predict which button someone will press with 60, 70% accuracy before they're conscious of which decision they've made. Now, what Eddie argues there is that the reason many people assume or are worried that neuroscience and determinism rule out free will is a fear of what he calls bypassing. And what he wants to argue is determinism does not imply bypassing. By bypassing, he means your conscious, deliberative decision-making procedures are bypassed, or they don't play any role. Now, I'm going to draw a kind of cartoonish representation of this, but I think it'll help. So we can distinguish between conscious and unconscious. So let's say the UC is unconscious, conscious is conscious, versus C is conscious. I'll make conscious the front, even though it's not that simple, obviously, but just to a first approximation, let's say like frontal lobe, related deliberation. So there's all this activity back here, unconscious going on before you're aware of what you'll think next, and then there's conscious processing here. So, and then there's your behavior, so whatever you do. So you choose to, let's say you're thinking whether to give money to a homeless person. We'll pick a more morally loaded case than button pushing. So you think about whether to do this. So that's the behavior at the end. Bypassing would be something like this, where the conscious decision-making that you engage in plays no role. You can predict what someone will do entirely based on looking at their unconscious processing. That's what he means by bypassing. And there are some cases where you can get something like that. There are some situations where you can make someone do something for reasons they are not aware of. Right? I'm sure you all know of cases like that in psychology. So for example, there's a famous study where you show 5 articles of clothing, I forget what it is, like scarves or something, and they're all identical, and you tell them, okay, pick one, and people always, or at least are much more likely to pick the one on the right. You ask them why, and what they say is, it's got a good weight to it, or it's smoother than the other ones, and we know that's not why. So in that case, yes, their conscious deliberation has been bypassed, but we should only be worried if that's always the case. And I'll just say, it's conceptually possible that all the machinery of conscious deliberation is always bypassed. But it would be very, very surprising if that was true. Because if it was true, why the hell would evolution build all this machinery for conscious deliberative processing? It would be a total waste if it had no effect ever on your behavior. So as long as it's the case, which it almost certainly is, that conscious processing, at least often, has an effect on what you decide to do, that's all the free will we need. At least that's what Dennett and Nomius, my supervisor, would argue. They're allies on this particular question. So Dennett has written entire books on free will, but that's good enough for our purposes. Any questions on free will? Okay. Okay. Next, we have to talk about three kinds of minds. Or sorry, four. Mix it up with the stances. So for the stances, Dennett has three. For the types of mind, there are four. And don't try to line them up with the stances. All of these creatures you could usefully apply the intentional stance to, maybe to varying degrees, but I wouldn't try to make a connection there. This is a different way of carving up the world. So these are, at least in the standard cases, used for different types of biological systems. So the first kind of creature, which is the simplest, is a Darwinian creature. So here's the idea. So organisms, which I'll draw just as a simple entity, have different genotypes. They have different genotypes which predispose them to different sorts of behavior. So maybe genotype A, B, and C. And these orient them to do specific kinds of behavior in the world. So A, B, and C. And then what happens is some of these creatures die and don't pass on their genes. So if there's a genotype which biases an organism to enjoy jumping from heights, that organism does not pass on its genes. So genotype C is eliminated, and let's say B is the only one that predisposes the organism to an adaptive kind of behavior. Well then, that organism is going to increase, or that genotype is going to increase in frequency. And then when you ask, why is that creature doing that, you give this kind of explanation. It does that because doing that, or a genetic tendency which allowed the organism to do that, tended to increase in frequency because it was suited to the environment. So that's the simplest kind of creature or mind. The next level is maybe I should have started over there and moved over, but so it's going to increase in complexity. Is a Skinnerian mind. Now, as you move up, the higher level minds will still be the lower levels too. So a Skinnerian mind or a Skinnerian creature will still also be a Darwinian creature. But it has a new added ability, which is it can engage in trial and error with its behavior. So it can randomly try different sorts of behavior. And when some of those behaviors result in pain or something, or an unpleasant state, it will stop engaging in those behaviors. So, the animal touches a fire and it hurts, then it is less likely to do that in the future. Obviously, this is called Skinnerian because of operant condition, right? If an action is followed by an unpleasant consequence, that behavior decreases in frequency over time. So, ow, that hurts, okay, keep doing B. Because it didn't cause pain. Or because it did cause a pleasant experience. And then so again, I should have started over there, but whatever. So Next creature up is a pauperian creature. I believe there was a question on this in the test. So this creature can imagine different possible decisions, different possible actions. And can think about what will follow if you do that. So, no, that one's bad, that one's bad. Okay, we should do this, and then it'll do that. Obviously named after Karl Popper, because the idea is you're kind of testing out conjectures or testing out ideas, but for Dennett, these creatures that he's named do so in their head. So I think there's a quote from Popper which is, we let our ideas die instead of us. That's basically the idea. You test the ideas without actually touching the hot stove or what have you. And then the final type, which is named after the least famous person of the four, so a Gregorian creature. This is named after the psychologist Richard Gregory. I'm afraid to ask, but do any of you remember the phrase top-down processing from intro psych? Okay, good. He didn't repress everything. So Richard Gregory invented that concept, if you want to make a connection. So he's an important psychologist. So what a Gregorian creature can do is engage in self-conscious thought. So it doesn't just think, it doesn't just represent different possible choices, it can think about its thinking. It can represent how it is representing the world. It's a bit kind of hard to say those sentences up, those second order sentences, but that's what it is. So it can, and it's harder to represent this visually, but you can imagine a sentence like, are there other ways of thinking about this? Are there other ways of testing these ideas? And then changing how it thinks about them. So it doesn't just think about different possible behaviors, it can think about its thinking. Hence the connection to top-down processing from Richard Gregory. And then it'll choose something on that basis. Okay, so those are the four levels, from Darwinian at the bottom to Gregorian on the top. Any questions about those four types of mind or types of creature? So as far as real examples, so a kind of bacteria or something would probably be a Darwinian creature. They don't really sample different behaviors. They have very simple dispositions given to them by their genes. Most animals are going to be at least Skinnerian creatures, right? If you burn them or poke them, they're going to learn to behave differently on that basis. Probably most mammals are going to be some kind of pauperian creature, at least, right? They can think to some degree. Dennett is going to say only humans fall into the last bucket. Only humans are Gregorian creatures because we are the only ones with language, and we are the only ones that can think about our thinking, or represent how we are representing the world. That's what the book means, by the way, by higher order representation. It means representing your representations. So this is a very nice picture, and one thing that's nice about this is it shows that there's a continuity between these different kinds of minds. And the unifying feature is trial and error processing. So Popper would have quite liked this. It's trial and error all the way down. A process of throwing out different behaviors or ideas and keeping with the ones that don't get falsified or that don't get punished, depending on what term you want to use. Okay, we still have a little under 15 minutes, so I'll be able to talk a little bit about Dan's view of consciousness. So one thing that Dennett wants to argue against, any questions on these? I guess I already asked that. Okay, so one thing that Dennett argues against, it's a term that he made up. People tend not to use this term for their own view. It's usually a term of abuse. He argues against a view which he calls the Cartesian theater. Cartesian meaning related to Descartes. Which is the view that there's a kind of inner show or an inner movie of some kind. It's very tempting to speak that way, and you may be able to cash it out in a modified way, but to a first approximation, this is a very bad way of thinking about how the brain works. As we said in the behaviorism section, an immediate problem is if you have an inner show, you have to ask, well, who's viewing the show? What's going on in there, in that entity's head? And then you wind up with an infinite regress, right? Because you have to say there's a show in that thing's head, and then that goes on forever. Dennett is, broadly speaking, a functionalist about consciousness, meaning he thinks you should define consciousness in terms of what it does. But with regard to that very tempting sense that there's a kind of inner show or an inner theater of colors and sounds, etc., with regard to that, he is an illusionist. He thinks that there ain't no such thing. It seems like there is, but in fact there is not. As far as what consciousness actually is, one very helpful phrase he uses, and it's not quite a full-fledged theory, though there are theories that are similar, and this is in one of the readings that I've listed that's optional, is the idea of fame in the brain. So in neuroscience, they have an idea called the global workspace theory. That's quite similar to this, but this is a kind of nice metaphor for what's going on. So, this is the brain. So the back of the brain is the visual area. At least parts of the temporal lobe are auditory, so related to hearing. And then there's the motor cortex, which sends commands to the mouth or other parts of the body to move. This should, again, be a review. Just to give you a sense of where different parts of the brain are. So what Dennett says is, whatever event causes the most widespread activation, or fame if you like, that's the event you're conscious of. What does it mean that you're conscious of it? Well, it means it's more likely to lead to you saying things. It's the kind of event that you're going to talk about. It's more likely to leave traces in memory that you can later talk about. It's more likely to cause various emotional reactions. So 10 seconds ago, I was not conscious of the leaves out here. The light was going into my head, or into my eyes, and into my brain. Some parts of my brain were detecting it. But, so maybe in the visual cortex there's a little pattern of activation that a neuroscientist could find that would correspond to, my awareness of, or not awareness, correspond to my brain's detecting the green leaves. But if I look over and I concentrate on it, so various things are happening. So there's more widespread activation based on my detection of the green leaves. For example, it's making me talk about it, so some part of my motor cortex is leading my mouth to talk about it. Traces are being laid down that we would call memory, and various other effects. So that event, for that period of time, is more famous in the brain, just meaning it's led to a more widespread activation. If there was a loud bang over there, probably the event in auditory cortex would also lead to more widespread activation, including various emotional responses. and then that's the event I would be conscious of. Now, obviously this is a very rough sketch. The neuroscientific details are going to be way more complicated, but actually what's nice about this is many different theories, even ones with very different commitments, converge on something like this. So I won't give the names, but there's different theories that have something like this at their core. Now again, there's a temptation, which is to think that once an event in the brain leads to this fame or widespread activation, then it glows with consciousness, this extra qualia, which is the term we'll see in the Chalmers chapter. Qualia just meaning, the inner quality, what it's like to have the experience. That's a very tempting way to think, and what Dennett wants to say is no. There's no extra sauce, there's no extra oomph that happens. All that consciousness is this widespread activation and the various effects that the widespread activation has. So this will probably be the last thing we have time for. I'll show a video of Dennett talking about this idea of fame in the brain. So I'll show that, and that will probably take us to the end. Okay, so one concluding sentence that I have that'll close off the Dennett section for today. So on Friday I'll have a tiny bit more to say about him, and then we'll start David Chalmers and the consciousness section. But he said it in passing there, but it's a very nice phrase. I think I even put it in the key terms. There is no second transduction. So transduction, another term from intro, is when signals from the environment are transformed into neural signals. So like the cones in the back of the eye, right? Light hits them, that light is transduced into spike trains, right? Neural signals that are sent to the brain. And it's again tempting to think once they're in the brain, they must be transduced again into this magic inner consciousness. And Dennett's claim is there is no such process. There is no second transduction. Once it's been transformed from a signal from the environment into a neural signal, after that it's all neural signals, nothing else. So thus, no second transduction. Okay, so you can think about that, and next class, the last class of content, we'll talk more about